All right, guys. So the Simpsons have canceled Apu, and King of the Hill from Mike Judge is coming back, but they're not gonna have Kahn. So let me get this understood. It seems like now, because of political correctness and sensibilities and this and that, the Simpsons can't have Apu. King of the Hill's coming back, one of the greatest TV shows of American history, in my opinion. Mike Judge is a genius. From Beavis and Butthead to King of the Hill, portraying American culture in a way that, it's just incredible, the work that Mike Judge did. But I think if they're going to revive King of the Hill and they're going to start to now not have characters like Kahn on there, if we're not going to be able to feature Asians, Hispanics, and Blacks in any type of comical sense, because it's insensitive, then why are we going to have white people be featured in any, like if we can't have Kahn because he's Laotian and the way he's portrayed in a comical sense, we won't be able to have Boomhauer either. What difference, if we're not allowed to portray Asians and Hispanics and Blacks in any type of comical way, how are we going to allow Boomhauer to be featured as a redneck, let's say? Doesn't make sense. You're either going to allow everything or you're going to allow nothing. But I'm really disappointed that if King of the Hill does come back, that they're not going to have Kahn. And that the reason they're not going to have Kahn is because he's Asian and they're portraying him in a comical way. I can guarantee you, in fact, if you go on YouTube, you're going to see more Asians are upset that Kahn is not being featured on King of the Hill than there are Asians that feel offended by it. The same thing with Apu. I looked up Apu. He was on The Simpsons, and it seems like several people have been vocal in the Asian community, have been vocal that they don't feel that Apu being taken away from The Simpsons is right. So I didn't run into too many people that felt they were offended by Apu. I ran into more people that felt the fact he was taken away from the show was offensive. So now you're entering where even like the TV shows that we love, like The Simpsons and King of the Hill, are not allowed to have Asians depicted in a comical sense, even though the vast majority of Asians actually enjoy watching these characters. So what's happening now is TV shows like The Simpsons and any real comic TV show that's just pretty much part of American culture, maybe King of the Hill or The Simpsons, they're not going to be able to feature any type of Asian person or Hispanic or Black because it's done in a comical sense. That doesn't make any sense. My question is, if we're not going to have Kahn because he's Laotian featured in a comical sense on King of the Hill, how are we still going to have Boomhauer being featured as a redneck? The whole concept of King of the Hill, which is one of my favorite, if not my favorite TV show ever, is that you had these awkwardly conservative people in Texas and their interactions with Mexicans and all these other people and Laotians. That was the comic essence of King of the Hill. So we're going to bring back King of the Hill. And we're not going to have the comical essence of these awkwardly conservative Americans interacting with all these other nationalities. That is what made King of the Hill incredible. I'm Cuban. King of the Hill, their presentation of Cubans was the worst possible. At least the Asians and the Blacks got featured in King of the Hill in some type of presentational way, where Cubans were just considered like the absolute most appalling thing ever. And you can see me smile because I really enjoy the way Mike Judge and them put together, Greg Daniels, the way they put together Cubans on King of the Hill was as the most just horrendous. They didn't even have characters with the Cubans. They just had commentary on Cubans. And it was always the most hateful, most unapologetically ignorant comments possible. Inaccurate as well, very inaccurate. But just that gave it the most comical edge possible. So as a Cuban, when King of the Hill mentioned Cubans, it was always in an inaccurate, just way off from reality. It was never like within a embracing fashion. Whenever they mentioned Cubans, it was always like in the worst context possible. Cotton Hill in particular just hated Cubans. Every scene they ever had where they mentioned the Cuban was in a very derogatory fashion, and I absolutely loved it as a Cuban. Never had a problem with it. In the case of Apu, I'm watching a comedian right now. You know, he's not happy about Apu being taken out of The Simpsons. He says, you know, he's being featured as an Asian who's a business owner, ripping off white people. He thinks it's hilarious, and it's accurate, and that's what makes it hilarious. So if now we're not going to be able to feature all these ethnic people in a comical sense on these TV shows because it hurts the sensibilities of who? Asians aren't offended by the Asian stuff. I'm a Cuban. I will tell you, if King of the Hill goes all out nuts on Cubans, I would love it. Wouldn't be offended by it. For me to even like King of the Hill, but Simpsons. But look at like Dave Chappelle. Dave Chappelle made some of the most pushy, edgy TV shows ever. With the Chappelle Show, he had the racial draft, was possibly the most borderline offensive thing he ever did. You know, I don't really recall any moment. I think the racial draft for me was one of his episodes that made me feel uncomfortable in some sense or another with Dave Chappelle, because that was real factual people that were involved in that skit. It was more personal. And the comments that he made about Elian Gonzalez were somewhat just didn't sit right with me. I still love Dave Chappelle. I still admire his workability. I still watch all his other skits. Yes, that particular episode to me touched all the wrong chords. But do I hate him for it? No. Did that make me not want to watch him again? No. Dave Chappelle also did Half-Baked. And in Half-Baked, he had the Cuban character. I'm Cuban, B. He was slow. He was dumb. He was just, I figured the guy was high all the time. So there wasn't like this character was in any way. And even though his whole personality was supposed to be Cuban, if you pay really close attention, he looked and acted more Puerto Rican than Cuban. His vocabulary sounded more Puerto Rican than Cuban, and that could have been an inaccuracy done by accident or on purpose. Regardless, it didn't matter. It was hilarious. I'm just gonna say, if King of the Hill revival comes back and they get rid of that satire, racial undertone, I may not be interested in watching it. You have to understand that the diehard King of the Hill fan like myself expects to see ignorant white people doing completely ignorant white people crap. And if it's toned down, I'm not interested in seeing it. When I tune in to King of the Hill, I want to see ignorant, dumb hicks doing completely ignorant crap. And that is what made King of the Hill an incredible TV show. And as a minority who was featured on King of the Hill in the absolute worst fashion possible, I loved it. And I want to continue seeing that. If King of the Hill revival comes back and they are going to get rid of that, what do they even have? I mean, you have Beavis and Butthead. Some of the characters from that TV show spin off into the characters of King of the Hill. Now with this King of the Hill revival, I mean, Beavis and Butthead was about as obsolete and dumb of a TV show as it got. And they were definitely insensitive and just... Now there's a revival of Beavis and Butthead to a degree. I just don't even know how to put it. I guess if King of the Hill comes back and they strip away the character of that TV show. Bill Dovetree was from Louisiana or French, and he had just depression problems. that made his character. The Texans were pretty much just ignorant, and there was even an episode where Hank Hill, the realtor, went in there, and I think it was Peggy became a realtor, and she had to sell all the houses in the Mexican neighborhood, and then the Mexican neighborhood got gentrified with hipsters and stuff, and the Mexican people got they were displaced by Peggy Hill, and there's so many episodes of King of the Hill that just demonstrated episode after episode the awkwardness of these American, just simple American people going through these scenarios where other people are involved, like in the case of Peggy trying to sell the Mexican neighborhood, or the dog that thought, when the black guy thought the dog was racist because Hank Hill was racist and he wasn't racist. All of that was a time when television could portray things how they are in a comical way. If now we're going to look at just TV shows are going to go out and they're only going to allow those TV shows to present white people doing absolutely white things, they can't touch on any type of other ethnicity because then it's found offensive. What is the beauty of that? I mean, kind of the beauty of King of the Hill was watching how all of these characters interacted and went through phases, and how ignorant they were was part of the beauty. Like, I remember Luann's boyfriend or husband, he was like a complete redneck, big jacked up truck. Everything he did was completely redneck. He's one of my favorite characters. Then Lucky was his name, right? Lucky. And then you had Boomhauer. If we cannot present a stereotypical Asian, an Apu, or a Kahn being Laotian, or any other ethnicity, if we cannot present a stereotypical character, why is it okay then to show Boomhauer a stereotypical redneck? How is it okay to show a stereotypical redneck and not okay to show a stereotypical Laotian or Indian? There's no difference. I mean, Boomhauer, the way he talked, if you watch my first videos before I moved to Alabama, whenever I would do my redneck skits, I would do a Boomhauer accent. When I moved to Alabama, let me tell you that I had to cut off that. So when I was doing my Florida redneck videos and small town videos, I would use a Boomhauer like accent that kind of mimicked Boomhauer's. Let me tell you that stuff, right? So when I was doing that in Florida, here in Florida, that was acceptable. And I was doing that in Florida. I moved to Alabama. When I moved to Alabama, in that region of the country, making fun of that accent was not acceptable. So when I moved to Alabama, I had to stop using, if you guys remember, when I went to Alabama, I had to stop using my Boomhauer impersonations because it would offend the people in Alabama. Did I have that problem in Florida? I never had that problem in Florida. However, after living a year in Alabama, I picked up an Alabama accent, and then I cannot go back to doing a Boomhauer impersonation anymore because when I try to do a redneck impersonation, there's so many details of Alabama accents that when I talk, I now have this heavy Alabama influence with my redneck dialects or my impersonations that now I can't go back to doing a Boomhauer, because before when I was doing the Boomhauer impersonation, I hadn't picked up this Alabama accent. After I picked up the Alabama accent, I can't go back to doing Boomhauer because now Boomhauer, when I do the impersonation, I throw so many touches of Alabama accents that it doesn't authentically sound like Boomhauer. So I say that to let you know that the people in Alabama, for example, felt very self-conscious of a character like Boomhauer. They may not have voiced it. A lot of times when you go too far with impersonations and characters, you offend people, and 90% of the people laugh, but then there's that 10% that gets offended. but you'll never know they were offended because they just stopped watching. And I know this happens on my channel. I'll make a video and I'll see the analytics and say, ooh, I lost 4 subscribers here. What happened? And I go into the video and it'll show me where there was a drop off in viewership, or in timeline, and I'll see exactly what comment I said. And sometimes it's something subtle that can make your audience lose attention. The sad part is that many times as a creator, you don't get that feedback from your audience to know exactly which comment you said made them not want to watch anymore. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with comedy, it's impossible not to offend people. And with a character like Apu, I'm sure there were specific moments where Apu's character offended Asians. Did it offend every Asian? Probably not. But I am sure that there are specific episodes where specific Asian people saw it and they were like, I don't feel comfortable. With me, I love Dave Chappelle's work. All his skits, some of them were, I can't even mention some of these. I'll tell you what they were. The family that had the interesting last name was one of my favorite episodes because it touched on the word and how in the context that it's being used can be perceived in different ways. I highly doubt that any African Americans were offended by that episode. If anything, the vast majority of African Americans love that episode. And keep in mind, with an artist like Dave Chappelle, his audience a lot of times isn't African American. You have a lot of comedians whose audience is white, even though Dave Chappelle, I think where Dave Chappelle is weird is that Dave Chappelle created a content that might have, in his mind, been aimed at African Americans, but in reality, everybody was consuming Dave Chappelle, and his core following is probably white. I don't know when he goes to, when he does a concert, but there's definitely a lot of comedians who draw a much larger white audience, even though their content is explicitly African American. To mind comes artists like Lil Wayne. Lil Wayne makes rap music about Black African American life. His audience is teenage white kids, has always been, even to this day. When they asked Lil Wayne about Black Lives Matter, he was like, he said, Lil Wayne, when he was asked about Black Lives Matter, his response was like, I'm a millionaire thanks to little white kids listening to my music about me being black. He says, how can I think white people are racist when my audience is white? My channel's similar in that I'm Hispanic. I'm authentically Hispanic in my content. My audience is white and African American. Hispanics are just now starting to look at my content because they're moving. But me, the core following of my audience is either African American or white. Now I'm starting to get a little bit more Asian, a little bit more Hispanic, but the core of my following is like small town white people and inner city African Americans. Those are the people who watch me. When I first started my channel in Florida, I had a huge elderly following. When I started Florida Hood Blogs, my audience in my mind would be young people. My idea was to show the neighborhoods, like the inner city neighborhoods here in Florida, and by showing those places, I would be able to talk to young people about how they could make their lives better and avoid certain things that were harmful. When you're a creator, you don't get to pick your audience, okay? I'm sure Lil Wayne, when he initially started to do his music, he may have thought that he could have connected to African Americans. He didn't. He connected to white. In his mind, when he initially started doing his rap music, he might have thought that he was targeting an African American audience. Turns out that the consumer wasn't who he would have thought it would have been. His audience, to this day, is not a black audience, predominantly white, because that's who the consumer was for what he created. So when I started Florida Hood Blogs, the consumer for me, in my mind, would have been other Hispanic people and kids that were younger. My audience was elderly white people. I had to start making adjustments to my content to fit the narrative of my audience. Then, when I moved to Alabama, I picked up this huge following of youth when I started doing these small towns and stuff. So here I am catering to once I understood my audience was elderly, I start to cater to an elderly audience, and I pick up this youth following. And then recently it started to go back to a more elderly, more mature audience. Do I get to decide who watches my videos as a creator? Absolutely not. And many times the audience that you're targeting isn't who's watching. And it doesn't matter what you create, you don't know who's gonna consume it. I was just in Kentucky and I was in a car wash, and there was this young white girl in a Lexus, and she's listening to like T Grizzly rap, like just the most hardcore gangster rap ever. And it doesn't match her profile, but that's what she liked. And as a creator, you don't really get to decide who's gonna come and like your audience, what your audience is gonna want from you. In my case, what I've noticed with my audience is I have a lot of female African Americans. I don't really do too well with young African Americans because I feel like the way I talk a lot of times is aimed at a more mature African American. Like, I think a lot of older African Americans like my content because I speak on a level of maturity that they understand. And the younger African Americans have grown up with this cancel culture in their mind, where if you don't fit their narrative they want, you're automatically not a candidate for them to listen to. And then now people are just blinded. They're blinded in that only what they think needs to fit the narrative is what they'll listen to. And that, to me, I don't think it's good. I feel like the audience should be more open-minded. So like in my case, when I look through my subscribers, the ones that have profile photos and stuff, I see a lot of female African Americans that are older, a lot of older African American males, not too many young African Americans like my content, but the older ones do. And I think it's because they grew up in a time where there was more of a study, analyze, consume. But today, people just look at the cover face of something and automatically label it as good or bad without diving deeper into the reality of the content. Could it be that these creators of these TV shows are trying to target a younger audience? When I was young, I didn't like King of the Hill. I grew to like King of the Hill as I became more of an adult. So when King of the Hill was relevant, I didn't watch it. I tried watching it and I didn't understand it. Something like South Park would have been more commercial to somebody like my audience because it was more in a format that was understandable. Even South Park has gone way beyond what's acceptable, not only in how just defiled their content is, but also in how far they go to offend people. Yet, the expectation for South Park is to do that. So they can go way above and beyond in disrespectful content, and it doesn't really surprise people. But the thing is, like when a Martha Stewart or just anybody that is very neutral makes the slightest comment, makes the slightest mistake, they eat these people up. Because again, the audience now, the younger audience, it's like a horse that's, like this. They only see the face cover. They don't see the whole picture. They're looking at the face cover of something. I don't understand how the audience today has come to being so narrow-minded. With my content, I have to be careful not to offend people. I offend a lot of people. A lot of people unsubscribe from my channel. And the sad part is a lot of times you don't understand why they unsubscribe because they don't even give you a clue. But with me, my goal is never to offend anybody. But you have to be comfortable. Like, I don't want an audience that is willing to just drop me because of one comment. I want an audience that can continually consume material, knowing that, like, if I feel like as a creator, like for example, King of the Hill was never openly racist. Did they have characters like Cotton who possibly were definitely openly racist? Yes. But then there were other characters in that show who were clearly level-headed and were able to mask the content as, yes, there were perhaps hateful individuals within those characters. Peggy had some character flaws. Hank Hill had some situations where he was uncomfortable. Every one of those characters had some type of insecurities and areas where they felt, or they could have been perceived as perhaps hateful or having a prejudice. In fact, there's a King of Hill episode where Hank Hill goes through a phase where people think he was racist, even though he wasn't. So the audience, when they take in King of the Hill, they don't perceive it as a... I never perceived Mike Daniels... Did I say Mike Daniels? I'm sorry. Greg Daniels, Mike Judge, none of their content, I never perceived it as it's coming from a hateful mindset, or it's coming from a... I never perceived it that way, because there was enough level-headed characters, and if you just watched maybe one clip, you could say, okay, in this one clip, perhaps if you just narrow it down to one clip, like where Cotton Hill is attacking the Japanese people at the restaurant, you could say, ooh, that's a bit too much. But all the other characters understood that what he was doing was wrong. With Apu, for example, I just feel that if Apu is an Indian and he's put out in a comical sense in his, antics of being an Indian, why can Homer? Because Homer is in all aspects an American white comical character. Why can the Simpsons then portray Homer as this comical white character and not portray Apu as the same exact thing but an Indian counterpart? It doesn't make sense. And you can make this argument for Family Guy. Family Guy definitely goes above and beyond. They push there's YouTubers who do reaction videos about Family Guy with comical skits that they go way above and beyond what's offensive. Sometimes the things that I thought would offend the African Americans, let's say if it's an African American creator reviewing a Family Guy episode that talks on race, sometimes I feel like the things that I thought would offend African Americans did not offend that person. But another small detail that didn't, and didn't seem offensive, did offend the African American creator when they did the reaction video. Also, same exact video clip being reviewed by different creators. Let's just say it's Family Guy. One African American creator in his reaction video will think that the entire context was hilarious. They loved it. And then you'll have other ones where you can tell they're just offended and appalled by it. Different people are going to have different opinions, but I really feel that the cancellation of Apu and Kahn and other characters like maybe Cleveland Brown in the future, I don't know. I think it's just, what are we going to be left with? Only white cartoons are going to be allowed to have a presence. And again, I don't even know who's making these calls, because at the end of the day, if you watch reviews, again, from Apu, from Indians and Asians, they love it. Kahn, if you find somebody that's Laotian or Vietnamese or Cambodian or whatever, along those lines of Asians, they love it. Absolutely love it. In the case of me as a Cuban, I can't really think of any Cuban characters other than in movies. Look at a great example, Scarface. So when I moved to Alabama, they really don't have too many specimens of Cubans in Alabama. One of the few specimens that people in Alabama have for Cubans, unfortunately, is Scarface. a lot of the people that I met in Alabama. So I never cared for Scarface as a movie. I think it's violent. It doesn't depict anything. Have I met Cubans that are like that? Absolutely. But that doesn't like define who Cubans are. Unfortunately, with the movie Scarface, when somebody like in Alabama who's never met a Cuban, I was in Alabama for a year, and I think the whole year I met one other Cuban, and that was because I was looking for it, and I finally found a restaurant where there's Mexicans and there happened to be a Cuban there. As an Alabama, you can go through your whole life and never meet a Cuban in real life. But just about everybody in Alabama, at some point or another, may have seen the movie Scarface. And let me tell you that a lot of what Alabamians think a Cuban is based solely off of the movie Scarface. And I would actually have a lot of very ignorant, because that's not hateful, it's ignorant. Okay? Hate and ignorance are two completely different things. And as you go through your day, you have to be able to identify hate and ignorance. They're not the same thing. They're both offensive. Ignorance, it doesn't merit the same response as hate. So as I went through Alabama, I would meet individuals who would just be like, you're Cuban, you're from South Florida, like you can get me all these crazy things. I'm like, that's not, and I mean like literally went through so many people that I would meet in Alabama. Like I remember one time I met this one dude, he was black, and he just started putting out, all the bells and whistles out for me, and food and drinks and attention. And I quickly understood that this guy thought I was Scarface. And, I had to just kind of tell him, hey, dude, it's not like that. Another person that I met in Alabama that I dealt with a lot, one of my neighbors also just understood, actually I think probably more than one of my neighbors in Alabama, that they just understood that Cubans were these ultra violent, just inaccurate. So like when it comes to a movie like Scarface that depicted a character in that element, I think it does a lot of harm to how people perceive Cubans, for example. Now, Cotton Hill blabbing on about how he doesn't like Cubans is hilarious. In the movie Half Baked, where the Cuban guy was an idiot and he was just a stupid pothead, that doesn't really hurt. It's stereotypical characters that really become a problem. And I think with the movie Scarface, it portrayed a very negative stereotype for a Cuban. And when people are only exposed to that character, it really demonizes the character of just an entire population. With characters like Apu, if you see an Indian, like let's say Indians or Asians, Apu was working at a store, ripping off customers at a convenience store. That's kind of what his character was about. And there's more to the character. They show him in parties. They show him interacting with people. At times, he would hang out with Homer. Okay, so there's more context than just that. Let's be clear that with the Apu character, he wasn't a character that was just one stereotypical thing. There was many assets to his personality portrayed on the TV show. And with the Apu character, he was portrayed as a business owner, ripping off people. Well, in my small town in Alabama, there were Asians that had a convenience store, and they were extravagantly expensive. So the character, despite being stereotypical, was a realistic depiction. Take it to Boomhauer. Boomhauer, despite being stereotypical, was an accurate description. Lucky, very stereotypical, very accurate description. Like when he told, and even there was times when the character Kahn for a while became a redneck, quit his job, got in El Camino, and he started hanging out with rednecks. And all those rednecks, like Lucky, took Kahn in as one of their own, disregarding his Asian background, just taken by his life situations. They wanted him to be a redneck, and they got him to move to the redneck neighborhood. And they were like, man, why don't you just come on down to our neighborhood where decent folks live? Stuff like that, where the characters perceived Kahn not just as this stereotypical character, but they were even willing, the other characters like Lucky were even willing to just abandon the notion that he was Asian and accept him as a redneck, as long as he was willing to portray his character the way he did. And in that particular episode, Kahn did not want to continue being a redneck because he was going to lose his mortgage, and he decided that he was going to get his job back. But again, you're portraying a character who is stereotypical, but has real life, just a real life persona with real life antics, and there's more to the character than just that stereotypical personality. I think where you kind of mess up is with characters like Scarface. Why won't that? To me, as a Cuban, that's what I really find offensive. I don't find a movie like Half Baked, where the Cubans are a pothead. I don't find that offensive. King of the Hill's portrayal and just how they demonize Cubans as these evil things. There's even another movie. It's called The Gods Must Be Crazy, and in part 2, which is a really hard episode, it's really hard to find. The Gods Must Be Crazy is an easy movie to find in their first version. The part 2 is a little bit more harder to find, but in part 2, which was less successful, there was a Cuban, and everybody, again, this narrative of everybody, and it's a repetitive narrative, if you haven't realized it, of everybody hating this Cuban. And I think why they're able to do that in movies is because in reality, a lot of Americans do like Cubans, do like the food, do like the culture, go to Miami and say they love it. So it's okay to portray Cubans as this hated character, because in real life, there's not like a stereotypical narrative behind that. But in the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy Part 2, this Cuban character is just, everybody hates him. Everybody, all the, the African characters hate this guy. It's a movie that's set in Africa. And everybody just absolutely hates this Cuban character in this movie. But this Cuban character, I found it was hilarious that nobody liked him, because he was in Angola, and Cubans went to Angola, had no business to be there. So it's, to me as a Cuban, the fact that nobody liked the Cuban and they all like just thought he was the biggest pile of crap in that movie, I found that hilarious as a Cuban. None of that offended me. However, the portrayal of Scarface, to me, initially at cover value, it doesn't offend me, but when I meet people and then they think that all Cubans are just going to be a Scarface, and I never experienced this in Florida, but I go to like Alabama, and I'm sure in Australia and Hong Kong and South Africa, people might just assume that if they're watching Scarface and this is the only depiction they have of a Cuban, there may be people all throughout the whole world who think that Cubans are this monster that the movie Scarface portrays. Because if I experienced it in Alabama, I'm sure in other parts of the world, Cubans are also going to be perceived that way. If you watch my channel, you know that's not true. If you watch the channel Traveling Robert, most gentle person in the world, definitely not true. And then there's also the American TV show that had the Cuban guy, that of course it's more romantic, and the white girl with the Cuban, and there's more of that. But at the end of the day, I do feel that Scarface, which is idolized by cartels, criminals, gangs, and just all types of criminal elements, just glamorize this character of Scarface. To me as a Cuban, I know Cubans that are like that, and it is one potential character of a Cuban, because I do know Cubans that live the Scarface story, but I don't feel that it's the only thing they should have. And I think when you have, like, I don't know anything about Laotians. Every concept that I understand about Laotians is because of the character Kahn. I've never met a Laotian. I've met Vietnamese, lots of Cambodian friends. I've met all types of Thailand people from Thailand, Vietnamese, a lot of Cambodians. I've never really met a Laotian. But based on the fact that there was a Laotian family featured on this King of the Hill, I was able to draw a positive kind of identity for Laotians. They were successful. They were business owners. Some of them were. There was one character that was a gang member, but there was different portrayals of these characters, and I think where they're failing really bad is these characters like Kahn, where it's Kahn, his wife, the daughter, the dog, or Apu, where he's featured with like within an Indian community. To get rid of these community-based characters is really not exactly good, because they offer an insight into people's cultures in a comical way, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's my thoughts and opinions. I really hope that if King of the Hill gets that revival, that they don't eliminate that satire and that racial, I like to call it racial, just, I don't know, it's just an element of just exploring our differences and ignorances that gave King of the Hill. Like, one of my favorite things, like, when I first started to watch King of the Hill, I had never really in real life been exposed to too many rednecks. And by watching King of the Hill, I was able to almost identify and come to appreciate American redneck culture, because it exposed them as real people with different characters. Before that, I hadn't had that. And there's definitely stereotypical characters. Take Larry the Cable Guy. It's a very stereotypical redneck character, but he's got a personality, good traits, bad traits. It's all comical, but even within characters like Larry the Cable Guy in some of his movies, like The Health Inspector, you can perceive a lot of good qualities. Like, he had righteousness with his job, that some things were right, some things were wrong. And despite the fact he was possibly the most comical person you would want as a health inspector, there were times where he knew he did right, knew wrong. And these types of stereotypical characters in movies and TV shows and cartoons are not bad. What are we going to portray if we get rid of that element? I mean, can you imagine watching a King of the Hill where their redneck antics and their ignorance isn't portrayed? That's what made that show have that. I mean, I don't think most Asians that saw Apu were offended by it. They're clearly not. They're offended by the fact they got rid of it. Now you have the same thing going on King of the Hill, and I don't like it. I think as a creator, you do have to know where to draw the line. There are creators who constantly push the line to see how much of a reaction they get from people, but a lot of the viewers that are watching that anticipation build up understand the full complexity of the character or the basis of the creation, where they know that that's not really a felt sentiment of the creator. And that happens with me a lot, where somebody who's new to my audience immediately gets triggered and offended. But my hardcore subscribers, who are the same demographic, they're not looking at a particular clip. They're looking at the whole context of the thing, and they understand that it's not bad. But somebody who watches my video for the first time may have the inclination to call me out as racist or insensitive, and I'll just tell them, watch more of my content. And eventually, when they watch more of my content, then they understand that there's not just one portrayal of characters or of opinions, but a broader vision of everything. And in that sense, I really do feel that if we're just gonna limit, and I have a video that I edited and I wanna upload it, and I'm sitting here like, because again, my content isn't, we do a lot of characters and a lot of plays and a lot of comedy, but a lot of what I do is real life information that people need. And when I look at those videos, you really gotta sit back and analyze, where do you cut the line? But dude, we're talking about cartoons here. These are cartoons. These are entertainment. These aren't like real estate brokers. These are cartoons. Entertainment. it's just there's no place for political correctness there.